Love the photo montage.
Hey, thanks so much. This is Wade Crowfoot. We're going to get started here in just about 30 seconds. So appreciate everyone joining and excited to be on here in just a moment. All right. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I'm our California Natural Resources Secretary, coming at you from Glasgow, Scotland, where the Conference of Parties, the 26th Conference of Parties is taking place. I've got leaders of our delegation here to share an update on just what's happening over here in Glasgow and why we're here. We've also got leaders from tribal government and local government to share their perspective on their time here. Well, let me just tell you who we're going to hear from. Leading our delegation is Lauren Sanchez, the governor's senior climate advisor, of course, Secretary Jared Blumenfeld from Cali, PA. We also, this is my, I'm going to play cameraman too. We have Shireen D'Souza, Deputy Secretary of Climate at Cali, PA. We have Amanda Hansen, our Deputy Secretary for Climate at the Natural Resources Agency. We have Javier Kinney, who works for the Yurok tribe, the Yurok tribal government, veteran of much international diplomacy. We have Linda Hopkins, who is an ocean scientist and the president of the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors. And then we have Dawn Sudermont-Baum, who's the acting general counsel at Yurok. So we're going to pack a lot into 45 minutes and hopefully give you a better sense of just what's happening here and why it matters to California, to tribal governments and to local governments. If you have a question, you can tap in your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So first, let's turn to you, Lauren, and then Jared. What is a COP? Why are we either here or why, you've just gotten back, and what are we trying to get done here? Over to you, Lauren.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Wade. And thanks to everyone for joining. I actually got back to Oakland late last night. But wow, that conference venue looks incredibly familiar. Great to see our partners, members of the administration, and the broader California delegation still on the ground and carrying the flag. So the COP is the annual UN climate conference. I was lucky enough to be there for the past week, including with our Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis, who was representing California. And I guess I would just say, kind of leaving the COP, being back here in Sacramento and Oakland, soaking up some much needed sun, I'm feeling incredibly hopeful about what I saw on the global stage from the past week. If you've been following along in the news, it was kind of a dizzying sort of pledging frenzy from 130 heads of state who were all there in the convention center with 30,000 delegates. But to be surrounded by so many committed climate warriors who are trying to tackle this crisis, along with all of our amazing advocacy community tuning in today, just made me feel re-energized to partner with all of you as we head into an exciting new year full of climate priorities for the governor and the entire administration. The best meeting I had while I was on the ground was with two of our youth activists who flew to COP from Glasgow. One, a young Latina, Alexandria Villaseñor, who, for those of you covering a lot of the COP coverage, may have seen our youth protest throughout Glasgow over the last 2 to 3 days. There's definitely a sense of kind of the negotiations inside the conference venue and then a lot of action and the broader movement outside. So it was great to connect with her and support her and other youth leaders on the ground there in California. I did just want to highlight a few awesome things the Lieutenant Governor was able to do last week. She joined panels with our fellow governors that were on the ground, and Gina McCarthy, the White House National Climate Advisor, and John Kerry, the special presidential envoy, really to say, we're so thrilled Biden is back in the game and back at the global table, but, California is here to support them and to keep leading and to keep being the tip of the spear as we charge forward towards all of our ambitious climate goals. The infrastructure package, of course, passed while we were there. So, an exciting kind of talking point for us all to share with the global community. We met with Mexican partners and Chinese partners, really focused on action and implementation and the details of kind of how the big overarching global agreement gets implemented at the state and local level. There were two big pledges on biodiversity and deforestation, and then on methane. And, excitingly, California has been doing a lot of work on both of those agendas. Wade, I'm hoping you and your team will talk a little bit about the Edinburgh Declaration, which the Lieutenant Governor was very excited to sign on to elevate all of our work to promote protecting nature and biodiversity. And then I'm hoping, Jared, you're able to talk a little bit about the LG's time touring a very exciting electric bus facility while we were there on the ground in Scotland. I should also mention we were joined by 15 members of the legislature, some great legislative partners and leaders who helped us carry California's message around hope and around urgency around this climate crisis. So thanks so much for having me, Wade. Jared, over to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm still in the UK. It's really good to join everyone and appreciate the folks who haven't made it. Hopefully we can kind of give you the impression, like Wade and the team can talk to you about the whole they're in, which is like they separate out the zone. So the blue zone is where you've got all the diplomacy, and it's like going into an IKEA. And actually the better zone is where all the folks are with that big globe behind them. So I guess if Lauren had hope, I mean, I do have hope that really the ambition that was articulated, we now have net zero pledges from nearly every jurisdiction in the world, including India, which was big news at the COP. Everywhere we went, people were kind of fascinated to find out how California was implementing. When Lauren talked about the $15 billion budget, I mean, in many cases, it was bigger than the budget of the entire country that we were talking to. In the case of, we did a bilat with Wales or even Scotland, the First Minister. People couldn't believe the scale of what California was putting towards this. So also to Lauren's point, when Eleni Kounalakis, the LG, met with what is, I think, the largest bus depot in the Western Hemisphere outside Glasgow, they put in a very large order for electric buses. We explained that in our last budget, we put in orders or the budget for 1,000 zero emission transit buses, 1,000 dredge trucks, and 1,000 school buses. They were like, what? How could you possibly do that? So people were continually kind of, I think, interested to learn about the implementation that California is engaged in at every single level, whether it's a low carbon fuel standard or the Chinese. We spent a lot of time talking about air pollution. Air pollution continues to be, and its intersectionality with health, a big issue that folks are interested in learning about California's history on those things. I know both Karen Ross, Secretary of Ag, is landing, and Leanne Randolph and David Hochschild. So other leaders really kind of filling in. I would say one of the things that we engaged in was around this thing called the Under Two Coalition that California created under Governor Brown, and it's really grown. It now represents states and regions from with 2 billion people living in them, and half the world's economy. And so from this little thing to now this, we continue to co-chair it with Scotland, Wales, and Baden-Württemberg, which is a part of Germany. And that meeting kind of took on a whole new sense of purpose around what we can really do to push the global agenda, and ideas like, what is California's position at the G20 or at these big global meetings. And then the final thing I'll say before turning it back to Wade is just really the outpouring of people's frustration. One of the people that I met there, a lawyer, was like, Jared, what the hell happened for the last 25 COPs? Like, do we really need another conference of the parties? Do we need to keep on meeting? Don't we know enough just to start getting this done? And I think the answer is, in California, we know enough to start doing what we're doing. And the message of how the nuts and bolts implementation happens, and the kind of budget. Whoa, the lights are going out here. Not enough power in the UK. The lessons that California can teach across the board, but also what we learned. I mean, I think what we really learned was that equity has to be engaged at every single element of what we're doing. And Lauren, you did a great job of making sure that that message got to everyone in every panel that we did. And I think it really is important for people to understand that we can't solve climate without solving these other intersectional issues. So I'm going to go and try and turn the light back on and turn it back over to Wade.
Hey, thanks so much, Jared. I'll say, we're proud of what happens in California and what we're doing collectively in California, but we also learn a ton. Or speaking for myself, I've learned a ton. Conversations with Jalisco, the state of Jalisco, Mexico come to mind. The autonomous region in southern Spain, Andalusia, Quebec, New South Wales, and Australia. So a lot of exchange of information, because it's really these states, these provinces, these cities that we're gonna have the responsibility to actually implement this work, either the pollution reduction or protecting our communities and our nature from climate change. Now, listen, we are very lucky to have veterans of international diplomacy actually working on our team. And I mentioned Lauren has worked with the State Department, and also Amanda and Shireen have. And so maybe first turning to Amanda, interested in your perspective on this COP versus others you've come to. Where are we at in this global conversation, and what does it mean for California and frankly the planet?
Well, I would say one thing that's different about this COP is it comes on the heels of the most sort of devastating scientific consensus on where we are in the climate crisis. And so I feel a lot of urgency here in a way that I certainly didn't feel during my time in the same way when I was at the State Department as I feel now. So I feel a lot of urgency. I think another really important shift that I've seen is just the people at the table. Obviously we've got our negotiators working hard to make progress, but there's so many other players here. We've got youth, we've got businesses, we've got local communities represented. It's a really powerful group of people here who are able to move the needle and shift toward the transition we need to make. And so I feel really hopeful about that.
That's great. Shireen, what do you view as potential key takeaways? I mean, we're about halfway through the COP. We've obviously had world leaders like President Biden already here, but a lot of work still underway. What do you think this COP26 in Scotland will really mean at the end of the day?
Yeah, Wade, thank you for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with so many Californians back home who are interested in what we're doing here on the ground. It's been such an honor to represent California in this space. And I feel like my perspective is really informed by the 4 years I spent as a negotiator for the US with the State Department in this same process. And to me, the thing that's most shocking is the shift from the focus exclusively on the negotiations to much more focus on what's happening outside of the negotiations. It almost feels like for the longest time, this process has been squarely focused on the negotiations, but that balance is shifting. And I feel it's really tangible to me now. And I think that's because, well, it's for a couple of reasons. One is because the framework has been created largely by the Paris Agreement, the negotiation of the rule book. So a lot of it is already in place, but it's also becoming increasingly clear that there's no more time for talking about agreements, talking about creating the framework, talking about negotiating. Now's the time for implementation and learning lessons from each other, sharing with each other. And I did a panel earlier today with Governor Brown from Oregon and representatives from the state of Washington and BC. And it was just so incredible to see the kind of leadership that California brings. The topic was methane emissions from organic waste. And it was just incredible to see the leadership that California brings in this space and so many other spaces, and to be able to sit next to our partners and say, this is what we're doing, and then be like, wow, it's pretty special. And that's not just in the methane space. That's not just in the organic waste diversion space. That's across the board when it comes to climate change, adaptation, mitigation, climate writ large. So it's been really cool.
Yeah, and I'll just second that. Lot of momentum, a lot of energy around what's happening right now and what we can actually learn from each other. The time for planning, the time for, framework setting is largely over. Certainly there's increased ambition, but even in the United States under President Biden, we now have a target to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030. So the focus and the accountability is on what will the federal government do? What will the states, local governments do? What will the sovereign tribal governments do? So on that note, I want to turn to Javier. And again, Javier Kinney serves as Carbon Project Manager at the Natural Resources Division of the Yurok Tribal Government. And of course, the Yurok Tribal Government is a sovereign government located along the Klamath River. And Javier, you're a bit of a veteran in some of these international discussions. So I'm interested in your perspective and really helping us understand, why the Yurok government is participating in both this COP and these international discussions.
No, thank you, Wade, and again, appreciate the opportunity to not only share the Yurok story, but also the action and dynamic innovation that the Yurok tribe and other indigenous peoples and communities are bringing to the table, which I think at this COP is particularly interesting in that is a focus. And I think we're putting that not only within the economic models, but in the technical expertise of our natural resources management, not only on the Yurok's ancestral territory or within the state of California, but on the global level as well. And so to be here with state partners, federal partners, local community partners, but most importantly, other indigenous global diplomacy efforts. Our chairman, James, and vice chairman Myers, as well as our tribal council, have made a commitment in acting as sovereigns, and not only our technical expertise, but again, in negotiations such as these, providing information and advice to our special envoys, as well as our other agency partners. And so it's exciting. It's also challenging as we go into our second week within these discussions. It's going to be an exponential growth that the world is looking at California, particularly the trend for state governments as well as indigenous communities and tribal governments to make sure and take the lead, not only the thought leadership, but the expertise in what we can offer, because all of the solutions that are going to come in addressing and resolving climate change will come from indigenous communities. And that particular balance of scientific knowledge, experience, and again, the dynamic efforts is going to only just grow. And as companies, industry, governments, non-governmental organizations, our youth, it's exciting to see, but it's also a very particular insightful process of being here on the ground and participating in those processes for the generational work to come.
Well, huge thanks. And I'll say, as the world looks to California for solutions, we look to tribal leadership for solutions. And California is on a journey to really both redress past wrongs, but learn from tribal stewardship of our natural environment that's really taken care of the land we know as California for several thousand years. Dawn, I'm interested in your perspective. Obviously, you and Javier are tag teaming this discussion. What perspectives do you have from your discussion so far?
It's been a really wonderful experience for the Yurok delegation to be here. To give you an example of the sort of concentrated level of discussions we can have here, we had productive meetings with the Deputy Special Envoy from the United States, along with other Indigenous peoples, about the United States commitments, how Indigenous peoples fit into that, and tribal governments. As you know, we've had great meetings with our state partners, all in one room. To get multiple secretaries in one room with the tribal government, we don't always have that kind of access. All the way down to meeting with scientific innovators, finding out what the cutting edge technology is, how we're being creative, and that exchange of information. And again, probably most inspiring is connecting with Indigenous peoples from around the world, hearing their challenges and their successes and their critical needs, and comparing notes, sharing our story about how we're handling and tackling climate change, and making sure that we support Indigenous people around the world as we're negotiating through this conference.
Yeah, and I have to underscore just the power of Indigenous leaders from around the world coming here, and frankly, folks from all over the world. Amanda and I walked in part of the way this morning with a woman from the Netherlands who leads in a business association of climate forward companies. And then when we got separated from her, we met a young man from Sudan who'd been, I think, almost 36 hours coming here as the result of a coup in Sudan, but he needed to be here because he leads a climate coalition in Sudan. So once again, really gratified. We have almost 200 people joining us here on this Zoom. If you have a question or a thought, please click on the Q&A button and put it in, and I'll move to that pretty soon. Also appreciate your patience. I am both camera person and host here, so we're using my webcam held in my hand. So I want to turn it to Linda Hopkins, and Linda serves as president of the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors, and we're new friends. We just actually met today. And I was really impressed with your level of focus while you're here, and also wanted to get your sort of set of fresh eyes, because this is your first conference of parties that you've been to. You're trained, I think, in some in ocean science, and at the same time, you're a local leader that's interested in climate action. So first of all, just interested, what brought you here, and what are your impressions so far?
Yeah, I'm actually a member of the delegation of Global Council for Science and the Environment, which is trying to partner local governments with academic institutions to drive sort of real-time climate mitigation and adaptation. I can say that, my fresh set of eyes, I assumed that I would be a small fish in a big sea. I think I feel like a plankton in the world ocean. But, honestly, all of the plankton floating around makes this beautiful ecosystem. And I have friends who are texting me and messaging me and, saying that they are very frustrated with what feels like a very slow pace of the international negotiations. And I think my message is that's not the only thing happening here. There are all of these beautiful connections being made. And I have been so inspired by the youth protests and by, I think, uplifting finally of the Indigenous voice at this conference, which is really, really inspirational, and people meaningfully listening and not just sort of paying lip service to it. But I have made amazing connections with people from all around the world who are facing very similar challenges to what we're facing in Sonoma County: drought, flood, fire. And that brainstorming, that coming together of ideas, that sharing of solutions, I think that's going to advance the conversation at this point, is I think might be going faster than the international negotiations, because we are problem solving and sharing information and bringing home policies and solutions in real time.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really, thank you for being here and the perspective you bring. I want to get to a couple of questions, and one that Linnea asks is, did you all hear about any new projects or efforts that other entities are implementing that you'd be interested in undertaking in California? The answer for me is yes. And what's interesting is sometimes you feel like we're kind of inventing, or we're the first ones at a different project or program. And when in fact, that's not the case. We talked to the Brittany, which is in France, about the work that they're doing on soil health. And we hooked them up with Secretary Ross, who's coming here, I think tomorrow, to actually go deeper on some interesting approaches that they're using. We spent time with Quebec, as I mentioned, and learned about how they're linking the work on preserving biodiversity with climate change, and specifically nature-based solutions. So those are ideas that, some of those ideas we'll be liberally borrowing here. But I'm interested in other sort of ideas or approaches that are intriguing or potentially applicable that any of you have heard.
No, thank you, Wade. And again, as we mentioned before, we've seen cooperation and just information sharing of stories, not only with industry, but with governments, non-governmental organizations. Particularly what struck us the most is our UROC work isn't just limited to Humboldt and Delaware County or within the state of California. With our partners, the Maori in New Zealand, our partners in Hawaii, we're looking at various ways and strategies and the impacts of climate change on our lands and resources. So we're taking that scientific knowledges, as well as the traditional ecological knowledges and traditions, as well as our cultural bearers, and making sure that they're involved in these processes. But we're also setting up the transition from an extractive climate strategy to a regenerative strategy. And that's not new to the Yurok tribe or Yurok people or communities, but sharing those within these multiple jurisdictions and multiple ecosystems is something that I think will actually catch on more and more, not only within the climate change strategy, but within the economic modeling, within the technology advancement, but most importantly, the cultural lifeways and ethos and principles of how business and culture and legal infrastructure and political status can actually be a value added within the work we're doing. So that's, again, the exciting aspects of what we're doing and we're going to continue to do. And we appreciate being in partnership with the state of California, the climate action and registries, and the other environmental organizations and supporters and allies to carry on that work.
It's great. I mean, I would add another example, which is the work that we're doing with Washington State on climate change. And I think Shireen mentioned, well, you mentioned Governor Brown, but Governor Inslee was here too. And he talked about the fact that the legislature there has now passed a cap and invest program to actually reduce pollution from stationary sources and reinvest into climate action in the state. And what was interesting, and there was a state senator here too, they thanked us in California. They had a consultation with the Air Resources Board to really understand the ins and outs of our approaches. And frankly, they said they think they improved some on their program as a result of learning from us. So it is this exchange, and boy, we don't have time to reinvent the wheel in each place. I want to just emphasize a point that Jared said too, which is we bring a new urgency from California, and I make sure that on any panel I talk on, because there's a lot of talk here, right? And there's a lot of people that have been to a lot of COPs, and it gets a little bit like people are getting comfortable with these discussions. And you know, what I talk about in California is climate change has gotten existential for us. We have forest fires that have burned 1 out of almost every 15 acres in our state in the last 2 years, as Californians know, destroyed whole communities. My daughter and kids across the state can't be outside playing for portions of the smoke season or the summer because of the toxic air. We've got, you know, our sister agency, Jared's over at Cal EPA and Office of Emergency Services, providing emergency water to communities that are running out of water because they rely on shallow groundwater wells amidst this drought. We have communities across the state that are experiencing record temperatures. We reached 130 degrees in California this past summer. We have vulnerable communities, vulnerable people that are impacted, losing their lives as a result of this. So I try to keep it very real and basically say the time for talking is through. We can coordinate, but it's all about action taking. The other key point I make, and I hear you guys making, is California is a proof point. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. In the last 18 years, as I understand it, we have reduced our carbon pollution by 26%, while we've grown our GDP by 68%. We're showing that we can decouple economic growth and prosperity from carbon pollution. One's going up, the other's going down. As Jared said and Lauren said, we have to do a better job ensuring that that prosperity is shared across all of our state. But it's really powerful when people hear these numbers, $15 billion that the governor and the legislature put to this. And some of our best practices, like our MPA network of 126 underwater parks, people take notice. They understand that actually we can do it. Now, we have obviously a lot to get done, and we do not have all the answers. And, you know, in our race to what we would call net zero here at Glasgow, which we'd call carbon neutrality back in California, there's a lot of work to get done. But I think it's indispensable that California is here banging that message. And I think, as Amanda or Shireen said, we have 15 legislators. 1 out of every 8 legislators in our state legislature is here. And they're all fanned out, actually preaching that message of the need to act now and the fact that we can do this together. I want to ask, just so there's some other questions coming in. Richard, who I know from OPC, says, was there any talk about expanding California's MPA program to a global stage? Well, what's interesting is as I learned, MPAs are actually an indigenous practice going back thousands of years. And it was in a COP conversation that I learned this. I came thinking, oh, you know, we've got this best practice across the world. We want to educate. And what I learned from some of our, what we used to call small island states, but now called large ocean states, is that their peoples have been instituting MPAs for thousands of years. in such a sophisticated way. They have different names in their languages for different kinds of marine protected areas, seasonal closures, geographical closures, rotating closures. And it was both humbling and really educating. But that's the kind of exchange, Richard, that we are talking about, which is how do we better protect our oceans? Let's see, I've got some friends here. Lewis asks, any conversations about carbon pricing or carbon markets? What's happening with Quebec on this? Maybe I'd turn it to either Shireen or Jared for any thoughts on carbon pricing and the discussion with Quebec.
Shireen's probably the best place to know what the negotiations, and just to remind people, is a little bit bizarre because the sometimes world leaders come at the beginning, sometimes they come at the end. In Paris, they were there a lot during the whole thing, but this particular one, they all came at the beginning, but the final text is only negotiated at the end of next week. So it's a work in progress, but with that, Shireen's got probably the inside scoop. And Shireen, maybe talk about the conversation we had with the Africa delegation.
Yeah, well, actually what I wanted to highlight was a conversation I had earlier about with colleagues from Washington State about the Cap and Invest program that they have just started. And as Wade was saying, through discussions with CARB, they learned a lot of lessons from us. And they have taken this approach that I think there are lessons for us to learn, in which they're looking to reduce both greenhouse gas emissions, but also criteria pollutants. And so for us, I think one of the environmental justice and equity challenges we have to figure out how to address from our cap and trade program is how do you ensure that low-income communities, communities of color, do not become doubly impacted by cap and trade, right? Because high emitting facilities are allowed to continue buying credits and continuing to pollute in low-income neighborhoods where political capital, social capital is lacking. And so I think, for me, yes, there are Article 6 negotiations happening. I have not a ton of interest, and I don't think that they're super relevant for us in California, at least at this moment. But I think conversations like what I just described have been super useful.
That's great. And just for the uninitiated, these different articles, like Article 6, that's part of this international framework that's being discussed?
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 is about market mechanisms.
Got it. That's really helpful. I want Deirdre ask a question. Any discussions about water? And the answer is absolutely. I'll say that my experience with these international discussions is that they used to really focus on mitigation. In other words, driving down pollution. Now they are including both what we would call climate resilience and climate mitigation, or reaching that, carbon neutrality. California is not alone in being challenged on water, both this sort of weather whiplash of not enough water and then too much water. And it's really interesting that these Mediterranean climates, right? So like this includes, of course, the European Mediterranean, South Africa, Australia, California, are all having these similar challenges. And so there's real power in actually talking about these approaches. And so certainly there are these different tracks of discussion. And I think something that's pretty productive about this environment is it's almost like speed dating for ideas and collaboration, and you understand, which entities are doing what. And then, some of you in California know that we signed different MOUs with different governments, and that's all about then deepening the exchange, deepening the collaboration. And this kind of event is really helpful for understanding what makes sense there. Jared, any thoughts on that? And I want to make sure you're looped in now that the lights are back on.
Send me back on. Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I think you answered it super clearly.
Okay, great. Hey, there's Chris made a really good question around the link. Can we talk about sign-ons or new pledges at the conference? And one I'm really excited about is what's called the Edinboro Declaration. And what it does, so this is going to get a little wonky, but there is an international process on climate change, and that's what we're at right now. It's called the Conference of Parties, and it's the United Nations Climate Change Convention or Agreement. there's a parallel effort focused on biodiversity, right? We're tackling our planetary crisis of climate change, but also mass extinction and species loss. And that's been a focus of ours over the last couple of years in California, really focusing on what we need to do to protect our biodiversity. And so we've been part of a coalition of subnational governments, meaning provinces, states, cities, that are really trying to drive nations to do more to protect biodiversity. And so there's another process, which is called the Biodiversity Convention at the UN. And thanks to a suggestion of Assemblymember Laura Friedman and some of our own work, we decided to make California an official participant in that discussion. So at this event, we signed on to the Edinboro Declaration, and that is to essentially officially join the group of subnational governments that's now taking part in the actual negotiation on this international agreement on biodiversity. So in other words, while we want to elevate this and we're advancing a bunch of stuff in California, including a new target to conserve 30% of our land and coastal water by 2030, or our 30 by 30 target, we're now actually rolling up sleeves and getting involved in that discussion on international on biodiversity, much like we're already involved in the conversation on climate change. So that's really helpful. I think though, as we've said here today, a lot of our focus here is on implementation, how we can do it faster, how we can scale up, how we can help others scale up. We have really remarkable targets in the state and now, in our country. So while we'll continue to figure out what pledges to make, it's all about delivering at this point. We have just about 7 minutes left. And I want to just ask maybe a little bit of a speed round for each of us here. And I'm interested in a takeaway that each of us have that, folks joining us here today that, maybe aren't climate experts or might appreciate knowing since they weren't able to come to COP. So who'd like to go first? Okay, over to Amanda Hanson. Again, Amanda serves as our Deputy Secretary on all things climate change at our Natural Resources Agency.
Thank you. So I'd say an important takeaway for me, and I think for California and for everyone here, is that there really is no longer this tension and discussion around, do we address climate change or do we grow our economy? Do we address climate change or do we become a prosperous community? It is. Someone said today that, in fact, it was Sophie from the Business Coalition, said the most expensive thing that we can do now is nothing. And I just thought that was so well said and just so true on so many levels. So thank you, Sophie.
Thanks, Sophie from the Netherlands, wherever you are. Who else? Javier?
Yes, I can go next later. I think for us, it comes down to three basic principles. And again, I think you can just see it throughout not only our work, but what we can continue to do is respect, understanding, and action. So the respect, again, to recognize not only rights, but participation and inclusion rather than exclusion is going to be an exponential factor in not only climate change, but the ways that we come up with solutions and address and resolve practical and actionable results. Understanding, again, having a more basic respect for the non-jurisdictional aspect of watersheds, of rivers, of oceans, of land, of wildlife, and how those interface with each other. And again, the last thing is understanding in regards to the cultural lifeways of taking action. That whether it's youth, whether it's people of color, whether it's indigenous peoples, whether it's those individuals that have not necessarily participated in some formal way, to opening those lenses and providing the perspective that it's going to take for all of us to come together and take that action that's going to be needed, not only on a local and individual level, but on the federal as well as global level as global citizens. So we look forward to that, and we look forward to continuing this generational work.
Well put. Thanks so much for your leadership. Over to Dawn.
Wait, I'll share a phrase that really resonated with me that I heard last week, which is, there's no climate solution without Indigenous land rights.
Nice. Well put.
So I would just say, I would echo everything that has been said in the last couple minutes. The other thing, this is my first COP in 5 years, and my first COP with the state of California as opposed to with a national government. And it's been really great to see the focus on adaptation that I don't feel was as strong in the past. And certainly several years have passed since my last COP, but it used to feel like adaptation was this ugly stepsister, stepchild, whatever the phrase is. And it's really getting, or it was something that only developing countries cared about. And now it's something that across the board, writ large, everyone here in this space is like, oh, adaptation is really important. It's just as important as mitigation. So it's like, we can't be advancing just in one space. We have to be doing both simultaneously. And that, for me, that's really powerful.
Well put. Linda.
I think one of the most powerful messages that has come out of this COP is the focus on nature-based solutions. And I think actually, Wade, it was something that you said at one of the panels about sort of helping nature help heal us and help heal our planet. And I think that finally the recognition that ecosystem services are something that we need to invest in, something that we need to protect, and something that we need to steward into the future is something that I'm going to be taking back with me. And I'm also actually excited to take these international goals down to a local level. What does 30 by 30 look like in Sonoma County? How can we work onshore as well as offshore, with the state to enhance protections in our marine ecosystems, as well as some of our onshore resources?
That's super exciting. Jared.
I guess the thing that I took away is just a sense of urgency. I think, especially in California, we got a question from Fran Pavley, who was the leader who wrote AB 32 and so much of the climate legislation. Often it was legislators and leaders in California that were pushing. The big pivot inflection that I noticed here is that the world is now pushing and saying, you all need to act and do more, as opposed to kind of trying to bring the world along and say, we need to do this. Now the world's saying to the leaders, you need to do this. And that sense of incredible urgency, especially amongst youth, a sense that we're not going to solve this with the wealth inequality we have on the planet, which kind of echoes some of what Dawn was talking about in terms of land distribution and equity. And finally, just accountability. I think people are going to be looking a year from now and saying, what the hell did you all do? You made these big promises. Now you have to deliver.
Well put, Jared. So listen, we said we would be about 45 minutes. We appreciate being joined by all of these folks. We wanted to keep it relatively short. I will note that there are a lot of really good questions in the Q&A. So I'd ask my colleague Mark to be able to stay on them so we can capture all these. A couple of reporter questions too. So we'll make sure that that our press team is able to respond to those. In fact, if you want to, this might even be more efficient. If you want to make your question to us and want us to respond after this, if you can email us, as you see on the screen, at outreach@resources.ca.gov. Lots more to talk about. Great questions about the Colorado River, regenerative agriculture, carbon capture and storage, heat waves. No doubt there'll be other downloads after this conference of parties, but we thought it would be a great opportunity to give you a real-time update. So once again, thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thanks for our guests. Thanks for the work that you do. I should mention that there are dozens of leaders from California that are from our non-governmental organizations that are here learning, sharing, advocating, pushing. So it's really quite an impressive showing from California on the world stage. Thanks to you. It's about lunchtime in California. It's about almost 9 o'clock here. We've been here at this conference center for 11 hours and wish everybody well this week, and look forward to seeing you and talking to you all again soon. Have a good night or a good day. Take care.
Mm-hmm.